Welcome to Reaction with me, Iain Martin, for the latest of our Author in Conversation series. If you're not a subscriber to Reaction, hit the subscribe button below. And also you can visit the site and become a member of Reaction, where you get my weekly newsletter on politics. Now, I'm delighted to say I'm joined today by the author of The Man from the Future, The Visionary Life of John von Neumann. So welcome. Ananyo Bhattacharya, a fantastic, fascinating book. I've got so many questions. Can we begin really just by talking a bit about his early life? Where does this remarkable character, someone who has claimed to be one of the great geniuses of the 20th century, a visionary, tell us a bit about his early life?
Yeah, thanks very much, Iain. Yes, so he is a mathematical genius, a Hungarian Jewish mathematical genius who was born in 1903. Most of his working life would be spent in the States, but it was quite clear very early on to his parents, who are, quite well-to-do, that Janshi, as he was called in Hungarian, was rather different from other children. I mean, he did things like he devoured a sort of 50-volume history of the world, and he was able to remember vast tracts of it many, many years later. But really, it was his mathematical abilities that were noticed extremely early on. He was able to add together 6-7-digit numbers and in his head effortlessly. And he really went out and started chasing cutting edge mathematics from a very early age. He learned calculus at 8. From there on in, he was admitted to one of the elite schools, which Budapest had 3 or 4 of at the time, very highly regarded. And his mathematical talent, was again spotted pretty much straight away. He reduced one of his tutors to tears so quickly. So impressive was his ability. And he was essentially given a university course in mathematics as a teenager, and he was able to embark on a PhD, whilst to appease his father, who was a banker and worried about the prospects of his son. He also studied chemical engineering at the same time in Switzerland. So that was the young Janshi.
So he has this experience where it's almost as though his parents or his father fears that he's wasting his time, ironically, or that he's going down the wrong path academically. How would you characterize his earliest maths work when he comes to prominence? Now, I should point out I am no mathematician. I really enjoyed this book, and it is accessible for the layman, but there's quite a lot of complex maths in it, which you walk people through very well. But then, as a young man, what sort of problems does he set about solving? What grabs the attention of other mathematicians?
Right. So maths, when he was sort of 10 or 11, was going through massive ructions, and the way that he tackled this would have a rather decisive impact, and would really show up the way that he thought about problems later. And what I mean by that is he was able to kind of cleave away complications to real world problems and get down to the absolute brass tacks of a problem, and then solve it with his incredible mind. So what was going on in early 20th century maths was that set theory, which is essentially used to talk about groups of things in mathematics. Now, that could be prime numbers or whatever you want to prove a theorem about, had suddenly run into these unexpected difficulties. Now, set theory was kind of the language of mathematics by this stage. It was what mathematicians used all the time. And if there was a problem with it, then nothing really in mathematics was sound. And if mathematics isn't sound, the argument was, then what about the natural sciences? Maths is the language of the sciences. So so this was quite a big problem. And it had all started really with Bertrand Russell finding paradoxes at the heart of set theory. And these were similar in form to the liar's paradox, which is this statement is a lie. Now, do you believe this statement or not? You sort of, if it's true, then it's instantly problematic. And if it's false, it's also problematic. In an effort to sort of save mathematics from itself, von Neumann starts at, I think at 1617, by defining the numbers, the counting numbers themselves in a really rigorous way, because set theory, there's these paradoxes that invaded every part of maths, such that mathematicians couldn't even be sure that that the way that they were counting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, even that was safe from the assault of these strange paradoxes. But then that's not enough. And then as part of his PhD thesis, which he has a draft of by the age of 19 or 20, he takes set theory and produces a very rigorous version of set theory, and his axioms, his sort of basic assumptions only take up 1 page. And from there, he's able to recreate this whole morass of set theory. And it's really one of the first times that anybody's able to put set theory on relatively safe foundations. And there'd be other versions in the future, but just to give you a contrast, Bertrand Russell's attempt was the Principia Mathematica, and that spanned 3 volumes, and it took years and years to write, and it came up with a far less sort of elegant solution than von Neumann did at 19 with his PhD.
So it's clear there's something extraordinary going on with this guy's mind, and we'll come on to talk about the Second World War, his influence there, and in weaponry and development of weapons, computer. We'll come on to talk about the Cold War, where he was an early Cold War warrior, and his legacy and insights into the computer and the brain and stuff which we're grappling with now as a society. So we'll come to all of that, but first he has to get to the US. So tell us why and how that happens. Obviously, the backdrop in Europe, it goes without saying, makes it a no-brainer that he should try and leave to pursue his studies and his work elsewhere.
Right. Yes. I mean, he manages to leave before the problems start, but he's profoundly affected by what happens in Germany. It really changes him, I think, as a person. He starts off kind of as despite being probably the smartest person that we know of in the 20th century, with absolutely no exception. He is a relatively sort of normal child. He has normal friendships and interactions, albeit with people like Eugene Wigner, who would later win the Nobel Prize, another fellow Hungarian. But given how extraordinarily clever he is, he's a kind fellow, loves a good gag and a drink. But what happens in Germany opens up this rather other flip side of him, this rather cynical human being who loses his faith really in other humans to an extent. I mean, before this, he was he could never have imagined that Germany would take the turn that it did.
Yeah.
He was definitely an optimist about human nature, and he part of him definitely remains so.
Mm.
But what he saw happening in Germany changed him. So just to roll back, so the young John von Neumann has finished his PhD, and he heads to Germany to the University of Göttingen, and he's 22, and he goes there because David Hilbert, who is kind of the figurehead of maths really at the time, is there. And David Hilbert totally loves von Neumann for helping to solve these problems in set theory. So von Neumann's initial reason for going to Göttingen with a fellowship is to study with Hilbert. Now, at the same time that he arrives, there's another sort of young whiz kid there by the name of Werner Heisenberg. And Heisenberg is busily, just the year before von Neumann arrived, busily inventing this new science of the atom, which is very strange, called quantum mechanics. And Heisenberg's come up with one version of quantum mechanics, which looks at electrons jumping about within atoms, and the mathematics of it involves tables and rows of numbers inside tables called matrices. Now, just a few months later, Schrödinger, working in Vienna, comes up with what seems like an equally good take on this new science, which involves waves. Now, you've got these finite numbers in Heisenberg's theory, and you've got these continual waves in Schrödinger's, and nobody really knows what to make of this. What is this telling you about the nature of reality when it comes to the subatomic level? Nobody really knows, because you would expect the maths, or at least the physical picture, to tell you something about what's really going on. And of course, this remains a problem with quantum mechanics. What, if anything, does it, what sort of picture does it paint of the real world? And that's discussed even today. But what von Neumann does is he gets really fascinated by quantum mechanics, and he remains so. And he shows mathematically that these two pictures of the atom are two sides of the same coin. And he then works this up over the next several years into the first mathematically very rigorous view of quantum mechanics. And that even now, when we ponder questions like, can we have a proper quantum computer? Is it possible to entangle hundreds of atoms together? And questions like this, ultimately the maths of the atom is still very much von Neumann's. The mathematics is very much the version of quantum mechanics that von Neumann invented those years ago. So he finishes at Göttingen, and he's trying to get a job, and he becomes one of the youngest lecturers, I think, ever employed by the University of Berlin. But from 1930 onwards, it's very clear that he sees something very bad coming down the pipe. And in his letters to friends, he is talking about the possibility of another world war. He even suspects that European Jews might face a massacre. And he fortuitously, because his brilliance is now known, he gets an offer of a lectureship at Princeton, which is paid, in 1930, in Depression era America, a ridiculous amount of money. And his fellow Hungarian and friend of his, Eugene Wigner, is also invited to go to Princeton at this time.
And there was a move, wasn't there, really, Princeton being one of the main institutions leading this, really to try and build up American universities to match or to eclipse what was going on in Europe. And thank goodness they did do it, considering what happened. So there's this huge surge of American wealth, isn't there? America's become, even despite the Depression, the leading economic power, and it's not matched until you get to the 20s and 30s by investment and philanthropy related to university. So he's a beneficiary of that.
Yes, exactly. And a lot of this is coordinated by Veblen, who is another mathematician in the States, who has a lot of influence at Princeton. And eventually, this money, which comes in from, I think, the Bambergers, who had a department store and managed to sell up just in time before the Great Wall Street crash and make absolutely oodles of money, but they have no children, and there's two couples, and they bequeath a lot of this money to education. And with this money, eventually, what is set up is the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, which starts off as a sort of annex of Princeton briefly, before it becomes its own institute. Whilst the buildings are being built, the mathematicians are housed in Princeton, and they immediately start poaching the best European minds, and Einstein is one of their first recruits, and von Neumann is too, and von Neumann is the youngest of the lot. And so he joins the faculty there, and again, it's known as by envious Princetonians as the Institute for Advanced Lunch and the Institute for Advanced Salaries and so on. But there are no teaching commitments at all, and the professors are just free to think all day and all night, and for many of them, this is sort of the death knell of their careers, because there's no stimulus through students' questions or any chance to chat with more practically minded colleagues. It's a very theoretical institute, but for von Neumann, it's that's not the case, and he begins to do this incredible work whilst he's there.
Yeah. Let's. What makes sense? Is it to deal with game theory first or Second World War? Should we talk really? I mean, this is his contribution to the Manhattan Project, for example. The development of these weapons is central. How does that come about? Why is it that that academia is targeted and the best and brightest are co-opted by the American war effort?
Right. So, okay. So von Neumann, he had this premonition of war, and so he's determined, as he sees what's happening in Germany and the rise of sort of fascism and the Nazis, to help his newly adopted country. So he begins to look at the mathematics of explosions, and this is really interesting mathematics. It's it's complicated. It's very complicated hydrodynamics, and he becomes quickly an expert on this sort of mathematics. And he also begins to make himself known to the military through his fellow senior mathematicians, and he quickly begins to establish a reputation as somebody whose opinion and whose insight on matters you really want. And this is the beginning of his incredible career as a sort of consultant for the Navy, the Army, the Air Force, and he's beginning to be flown all over the country at the drop of a hat. At the same time, he's still working on pure mathematics. And so he is sent to wartime Britain, actually, in 1943, and that's to help the Royal Navy. And all we know about that visit is he was asked to look at German submarine bomb laying patterns because they'd changed the way they laid mines. And von Neumann was called in to see if he could make any sense of it, which he did very quickly and helped save quite a few British ships from disaster. But what else he did during those 6 months he was there isn't very well known. Now, Turing, the young Alan Turing, was also an acquaintance, and Alan Turing's first paper was actually developing work in one of von Neumann's papers on group theory. And Turing is a huge fan of von Neumann's work on quantum mechanics, and he asked von Neumann to write him a letter of reference. And Turing goes to Princeton and stays there for a couple of years as a result, but he comes back to Britain. So it's possible, but we don't know if von Neumann had this interaction with Alan Turing, who, whilst he was at Princeton, had received proofs of his paper on what we call now the universal Turing machine, which is considered a sort of very theoretical view of what a modern stored program computer is. Now, nobody saw it that way at the time. In fact, this was Turing's contribution to trying to solve to help solve this foundational crisis that we talked about earlier. So it was a paper in logic. Now, so after 6 months in Britain, he's suddenly called away by Robert Oppenheimer to who begs him really for help on something that he only calls in the letter a sort of Buck Rogers style project. And of course, this is the American efforts, top secret effort to build the atom bomb. And so he flies home. Now, of course, the atom bomb was it was still very much kind of basic research at the beginning. Just a few years earlier, many people didn't even think that a bomb would be feasible, and certainly not feasible before the end of the Second World War. But many of
where it overlaps, doesn't it, with the development of what became the computer, because what really matters, I suppose, is the speed of calculations. They're trying to make this thing work, aren't they? This is, they know in theory it should work, and it could be a weapon that wins the war that they want to get to first. But they need to do these calculations at enormous speed. So that's why I suppose they turn to people like von Neumann, because of the work that's going on at Princeton.
Yeah. So von Neumann has taken a deep interest in computing machines, and these were very early computing machines. They usually would run one program and sort of one program only, so they weren't the rather flexible things that we have now. But his initial contribution when he arrives at Los Alamos is immediately to get behind the implosion bomb. Now, there were two types of bomb that were being developed at Los Alamos. One was a gun type weapon where you get 2 bits of uranium and you bring them together very quickly. You get a critical mass and then boom. So that's pretty straightforward. And they were confident in that. But there was another idea kicking around about implosion. And this was this idea that if you can crush a ball of plutonium or uranium fast and evenly, then that will also create an explosion, a very powerful explosion, one more powerful than the gun-type weapon could achieve. And also importantly, it would work with plutonium. Now, there was a suspicion that the gun-type weapon wouldn't work with plutonium because you couldn't bring those 2 bits together fast enough without it sort of melting, and that turned out to be true. Now, von Neumann turns up and he said, no, you're approaching the implosion bomb all wrong. Let me show you how you do it. And with his expertise in explosives, he immediately sees that the right approach is sort of it's sort of arranging the shaped charges like a football, like a sort of geodesic pattern around it, and that results in this sort of circular wavefront. Now that requires massive amounts of calculation, and so Los Alamos, he said, it puts him in charge really of the computing side and sends him off here, there, and everywhere, scouring the country looking for computational power. And I think that's where the computer comes in, of course.
He defends Oppenheimer later, doesn't he? Just jumping ahead there to the Cold War, when there's suspicion. Well, because of Oppenheimer's communist views or affiliation, that his friend does defend him in those secret hearings.
He does. Von Neumann has this sort of rock solid reputation within military and government circles as, totally trustworthy. And Oppenheimer has these communist links. Now, von Neumann really dislikes communism just as much as he hates fascism, and he has this terrible experience of a very short-lived communist regime in Hungary.
Yeah.
But he knows and trusts Oppenheimer, and he thinks that essentially the whole way that the government is pursuing academics for their communist views at a time when nobody really understood what would happen in the Soviet Union later, never understood really the dangers of it. He thinks this is ridiculous. And so he steps in and becomes a very important witness for Oppenheimer. And meanwhile, Edvard Teller, who's another Hungarian childhood friend of von Neumann's, is the key witness against Oppenheimer. And this creates a rift through the scientific physics community at the time. Unfortunately, von Neumann's testimony is extremely important because it keeps Oppenheimer out of jail, and it makes it clear that he wasn't trying to sabotage Edward Teller's plans for this more powerful bomb, the hydrogen bomb. So it is important, but unfortunately, of course, Oppenheimer's security clearance is stripped nonetheless. And despite all of his work, really, he was the key figure in the management of the atom bomb project. He's still sort of humiliated over the next several years, and he knows he can no longer do any more work for the government.
Yeah. So a great contrast there with von Neumann, who in the Cold War becomes, so after 1945 and the victory against Japan, he becomes a key figure. And it's, you describe it really well in the book, this way in which what's produced by the Second World War is a reliance on science and top-end mathematicians, and the way in which the American military and American defense firms then look to von Neumann almost as a hero, and he's involved as a consultant in RAND, and he's also in favor initially of preemptive nuclear strike against the Soviet Union. So he's a real Cold War warrior, isn't he?
He is, although I think that's become, this almost the stereotypical view of von Neumann now. He was one of the influences behind Kubrick's Dr. Strangelove, and he used to turn up to government meetings later in life when he got cancer in a wheelchair. Hence, Strangelove was also wheelchair bound, but Strangelove was based on a number of people, including von Neumann's friend Edward Teller, who was a huge fan of building big bombs, and of course Herman Kahn, who was a RAND strategist, who became, very famous for thinking about the unthinkable. Now, immediately after the Second World War, von Neumann gets premonitions of a Third World War. Now, he no longer really believes that humanity will sort of do the right thing after what happens under the Nazis.
And he says to his wife, he thinks it's coming within, he doesn't know whether it'll be 2 years or 10 years, but he feels there is a Third World War on the way. That's
right. He's absolutely terrified. I mean, he wakes up in the middle of the night and in a sort of cold sweat, and starts talking about these sorts of prospects and the problems with technology spiraling out of control, or at least the rate of progress of advances in technology, he realizes is just accelerating at a massive level, and whether we can keep up with it, he has no confidence of that. So he becomes an advocate for a preemptive strike on the Soviet Union, and he thinks before they can get a nuclear arsenal, if they're bombed and the atom bombs are either America takes charge of them or some sort of world government, then we might be able to avoid this terrible outcome. The thing that I think gets overlooked is that a good minority of the American public were actually in favor of a preemptive strike.
Yes, hugely. It's a popular option at that point. It's a popular
option, and Bertrand and people and many intellectuals like Bertrand Russell, supposed pacifist, talks about the possibility of a preemptive strike, or at least threatening a preemptive strike to the Soviet Union. And if they refuse to give up their nuclear ambitions, then he suggests that they might have a quick war and sort it all out.
It just when you mention Russell in the book, there it captures the intensity of that period. Here is this lifelong pacifist essentially saying to the Soviets, look, give up your hopes of a program, join a world government, or face obliteration.
Yes, but utter desperation, really. I think. I mean, the world had just come through this awful war with millions dead, and I don't think anybody who had a clear-eyed view and was worried that there could be another one when there had already been two. So what was to stop human beings having another one? Was sort of at peace at that time. We're all desperately worried.
Yeah, but he becomes a key figure in the post-war world. Let's also talk about, because it does have an influence on his defense work and his thinking about problem solving and human nature. And you mentioned that, you described very well the paradox of his character, because there is a kindness there as well, but also he's someone who grows up in the shadow of the disintegration of European culture, the Nazis. He's then terrified by what's coming with the Cold War, and he's one of the inventors of game theory, which I'm going to ask you to explain, and that colors his thinking about how the Soviets or how an adversary would behave. Just wind back on the game theory thing. Why does that matter? Well, firstly, what is it?
Yeah,
you explain it in layman's terms, and then why does it end up having such an influence down to today, to business, defense, everything you can think of?
Right. So in a way, all of this once again goes back to this the foundational crisis and this ability of mathematicians to think very clearly about sort of real world problems and so on, of which von Neumann becomes an absolute expert. But generally, mathematicians of the early 20th century were quite optimistic. They felt that the problems of mathematics would be resolved, and mathematics could be applied to practically anything. And one of the areas that they began to look at became sort of fashionable was this idea of a mathematics of conflict. And one of the people who began to think about this was Emanuel Lasker. He was a chess grandmaster, but also a brilliant mathematician, but he was Jewish. He was one of Hilbert's brilliant students. And he, even despite David Hilbert's backing, he couldn't get a job in mathematics because of the sort of anti-Semitic nature of academia at the time. He found it very difficult, and so to subsidize his mathematics, Lasker ended up playing chess, which he did rather successfully. And he writes a book about chess where he he spends several chapters talking about sort of mathematics of conflict, but he doesn't really get anywhere. And the first person to really get somewhere is von Neumann, with his minimax theorem back in 1920 something, and the minimax theorem shows that in any two-player game of perfect information, there is always a solution. There is always a correct strategy to win. So and for example, we know what some of these are quite quickly. For example, if we're playing rock, paper, scissors, then everybody knows that if somebody keeps playing rock, they're going to lose. So we know that the correct way to sort of break even is to randomize your strategy. And this was at the heart of von Neumann's minimax theory, this idea of randomized strategies. But he then leaves this behind. He sort of loses interest because he's busy inventing the modern computer and also, helping with the atom bomb. But then in the middle of this, he meets an Austrian economist by the name of Oskar Morgenstern, who isn't Jewish, but has left Austria and become a sort of pariah with the Nazi party. So he has to stay, and he gets a job in Princeton, and he makes von Neumann's acquaintance there. And it's really, although Morgenstern contributes virtually nothing to the mathematics of game theory, he's always asking these annoying questions to sort of spur von Neumann on to invent it. And von Neumann lays down the kind of, produces the first mathematics of game theory in this massive book called Theory of Games and Economic Behavior, which he and Morgenstern draft during the war,
which then has a big impact on the development of economics, doesn't it? And post-war and business decision making.
Right.
So I going to come on to then so we get and people are going to think, well, what happened to this remarkable man? Did he have a long and happy retirement? Well, he didn't. He dies aged 53. His powers, much to his frustration, fade towards the end. Interestingly, converts to Catholicism, which I'd forgotten right at the end. But he embarks on a final burst of creativity, doesn't he? A final burst of work in a bid to understand the brain, and to understand the brain in relation to the possibilities of computers. This is his great sort of final mission and piece of work, isn't it?
Yes. So there's sort of three planks to this. So von Neumann, whilst he's involved with computing after the Second World War, he comes up with the blueprint, really, of the modern stored program computer. And so this is a device, a machine, where you can essentially read in any program you like into the memory, and then in line by line, the computer can execute this. And this is quite radically different from most of the computers, well, all the computers that have been built before. And it's now the architecture of every smartphone and pretty much every computer, but with a few exceptions. And all of these run on something called the von Neumann architecture. So this is sort of one plank of his thinking. And the other thing that he becomes interested in is not just computers that can calculate and compute, but computers that can actually make things, and more specifically, computers that can make other computers. So machines that can reproduce. And von Neumann produces a proof, the first ever mathematical proof, that shows machines can or could reproduce themselves and become more complicated and even evolve. And you have to remember that this is years before the Watson and Crick discovered the structure of DNA. It's years before we understand really the mechanisms of cell reproduction. But von Neumann's blueprint and proof is true for both machines and, if you like, biological machines. It's true for all sorts of reproduction. You need a code script. He realizes you need a way of copying that code and inserting it into the new machine or the new cell. And then you need the machinery to actually read the code and build the sort of husk, the rest of the machine, and that's pretty much the foundation of modern molecular biology. But it becomes later incredibly influential on people who would think of nanotechnology, this idea of tiny machines that would be able to make more machines to do our bidding and reproduce and multiply, and thus be able, despite their small size, to be able to achieve massive amounts. And it also inspires people to think of stuff like reproducing deep space probes later on, which we could send out into the galaxy looking for life across the universe, and all of these schemes. And as he's doing this, he's also thinking very deeply about the human brain and computers. And as he lies dying in a hospital bed, he's desperately trying to get his last set of lectures finished, and he never does finish them. And they are published a couple of years after his death as The Computer and the Brain, and the insights in it are still pertinent today. He realizes the similarities between computers and brains, but also the important differences between them. And most importantly, he realizes that the brain is a massively parallel machine.
Well, this is central, isn't it? And is a real cause for optimism. Actually, I thought reading the book is that central insight. Why is the brain different from a computer, and why is it that someone who may not have the brain capacity of von Neumann can still do something marvelous and inspirational, whether it be come up with an amusing joke or a pun? I mean, so explain why is that? You mentioned the question of it being parallel. What is different? What makes the human brain different?
Right. So you would expect at first sight the human brain to be massively inferior to one of von Neumann's computer machines, because it's so unreliable. It's a morass of cells firing off pulses to other parts of the cell. Now, computers have to have error correction mechanisms and so on, so that they don't, so calculations within them don't go wild. But computers are serial machines, and they are built mostly according to von Neumann's EDVAC report from 1945, where he sets out this vision of a stored program computer. And how they work is you have the program in memory, you shoot the first instruction off to the central processor unit, it gets processed, the instruction gets processed, and then it goes back to memory. And the data and the computer program are all stored in this memory. And that's a tremendously simple and reliable way of building a computing machine, which is why it's been so successful, and why these, we can talk on Zoom without the computer tripping up all the time. But that's not how the brain works. The brain does all sorts of things at the same time, and there is this no bottleneck in the way that you get with these serial machines, and that gives it a whole new power, which serial machines don't have. So what at first sight looks like this rather clumsy piece of equipment is actually an incredibly sophisticated organ indeed. And of course, in some very naive ways, we're trying to replicate the brain's parallel workings with stuff like neural networks, and artificial intelligence today.
So that final burst of work, he's pointing towards DNA discoveries in molecular biology. He is, as you describe him in the book, the man from the future. He's pointing out where we're headed. Towards the end, in one of his final pieces, he does talk, as you say, under the ominous heading, survival, a possibility. He continues, for progress there is no cure. Any attempt to find automatically safe channels for the present explosive variety of progress must lead to frustration. The only safety possible is relative, and it lies in intelligent exercise of day-to-day judgment. So what you're talking about there is really there is no recipe, as he says, for avoiding extinction at the hands of technology. How on earth do you think, how are we supposed to deal with all of this in terms of politics and philosophy? And I mean, it seems unstoppable, but can we shape it?
Well, I mean, that's a huge question.
I hope the answer is we can in some way.
Well, like von Neumann, I mean, he was trying there for a little optimism. He points to the characteristics that have saved our necks so far. I do believe ultimately we don't want to wipe ourselves out, but von Neumann saw that possibility. At the moment, they were in Los Alamos one day talking about what they thought supernovae were, and he joked that they were highly advanced civilizations blowing themselves up after
cosmic suicide. That they've decided that they really can't solve all these problems, and there's no way out other than to destroy their civilization. But he also towards the end then it does get this idea very early on, whether it is related to climate, environment, nuclear weapons. He gets this idea of mankind almost outgrowing Earth, or reaching the sort of edge of the possibilities of being contained by Earth, which is very far ahead of its time.
Yes. He sees really the new technologies that we're developing at this rate. We make us feel the pressure of being sort of earthbound, crowded in a planet, really the first time. And he sees human affairs are just connected together far more closely than ever before. And one of the things he talks about is we're going to need new political structures to help cope with this. And you could see our efforts, such as they are, to try and solve global warming, this huge problem that we're all facing. You could see some of those new political efforts there as perhaps an embodiment of the kind of thing that he was talking about.
Yeah.
But yes, there's this incredible sense of claustrophobia that comes across from reading that that essay, which is one of his last.
So it sounds banal, but a final question. I mean, considering what you've outlined and explain in the book, it sounds banal to talk in terms of legacy. He achieved so much. He's such an interesting character. But how do you, having invested so much time in the book, clearly a labor of love, how do you feel about von Neumann, the man, at the end of it? His achievements are huge, but he is this baffling character as well, isn't he?
He is, and I try and leave this question open because, as I'm sure you've discovered whilst reading the book, it's not really a conventional biography in the sense that we don't follow him all the way through it. And what we're doing is really looking at the impact of his ideas. It's an intellectual biography. It's a history of ideas, and we look at the impact of those ideas several decades down the line to the present day. I did that really to establish for the first time his huge importance, because I think he's rather been overlooked because he was so far ahead of his time. The ideas are only beginning to mature now. The impression that I got, and his daughter, who's alive today, Marina, who was a top economist and sat on the board of various companies and was the first female economic advisor to any president. I mean, I asked her, well, which do you think is the real von Neumann here? Was it all a mask? Was he actually all this, his kindness and his way with jokes and dirty limericks, his sort of hard drinking, his love of sort of drinking and joking and parties, which are well known, and his love of fast cars. That was that all a front to disguise this kind of deeply cynical human being? And she said, no, not at all. They were both very much true, and he flipped between them sometimes. Just in the middle of talking to me as a teenager, he would start worrying and ruminating about the end of the human race and how awful we were to each other. So it's quite clear that he was a very conflicted and complex human being. I mean, his acts of kindness were less talked about, and they were carried out in secret. But during the research for the book, for example, I came across an interview with Mandelbrot, who would go on to invent chaos theory. But in the early days, he had broached some of his ideas and early maths with John von Neumann, and von Neumann wrote him a letter of recommendation, and Mandelbrot came to the IAS and worked there for a couple of years. Now, years later, many years after von Neumann had passed away from cancer, Mandelbrot was unhappy with his boss, and he started looking for another job, and he finds that wherever he writes to, a door has been opened for him. And it turns out that von Neumann had put in a good word for him amongst the sort of top mathematicians and business at the time. And they said, look, this Mandelbrot guy, he's got some great ideas, but he's going to have a really tough time. And one day he may come looking for help. And this had all been done without Mandelbrot's knowledge. And another trivial thing which gives you an idea of the man was this a time in the middle of the Second World War, a Hungarian builder who's moved to the US writes to him and says, I'm really interested in maths, but I can't get any sort of foundational kind of high school level maths books in this country, but I want to teach myself some more maths. So where can I get hold of the right books? And so von Neumann writes to one of his Hungarian friends and gets them in the middle of the war to ship Hungarian maths textbooks over to this guy.
Why do you think, and your book corrects this, but why has he been overlooked, do you think, in comparison to someone, in popular culture, the image of, say, Einstein, or in the UK, Alan Turing? Why is the von Neumann story not better known?
That's a question that I pondered all the way through it, and by the end of the book, I had no definite answers. But it seems to me that we can often associate one big idea, with our geniuses. So Einstein, you have relativity; Turing, you have computer science. Although, as is clear in my book, Turing had very little to do with the invention of the modern computer, but a lot to do in the end with computer science. But with von Neumann, his contributions were so widespread and so influential and so ahead of their time. I think people have tended to forget about him. And at the time, back in the 50s, as in his heyday, he was very well known. He was probably the second most famous scientist in the US at the time. And what he was doing was sort of front page news of the New York Times. But since then, his legacy has sort of fallen by the wayside. And I think part of the reason for that is because it's difficult to string all of those accomplishments together into a narrative to really understand how the way his brain works and how he was approaching all of these problems, which I've tried to address. But also some of his ideas, like the theory of reproducing automata, this idea that machines can make more machines. I mean, in some ways we're still only just beginning. We're at the threshold of that becoming a reality. So I think he was the man from the future. He still is in a way the man from the future. I think in the next decade or two, he will seem even more important than I hope he seems now as a result.
Well, you have in this book, you have reclaimed him, the man from the future, the visionary life of John von Neumann. Thank you very much for talking to us today. I mean, definitely one of my books of the year. If you're not a subscriber to Reaction, hit subscribe on the little button below. And also, if you visit the website, the address is below. You can become a member of Reaction. You get my weekly newsletter on politics every Saturday morning. You get Tim Marshall on geopolitics, Maggie Pagano on business and other matters, and all of the work from the brilliant team at Reaction. But until next time, thank you very much for listening and watching.